For 8 years, a billionaire's son never spoke, never walked, trapped in silence. Doctors said he was hopeless. But then one day, a maid turned on jazz, picked up a broom, and did something no expert ever could. What happened next? Left the entire mansion in shock. You could hear a pin drop in the Blakewood mansion, not just in the late hours of the night or early morning before the staff arrived, but even in the middle of the day, when the sunlight streamed through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows and the air should have been filled with life. And that silence? It always followed 8-year-old Henry Blake like a shadow, long, quiet, and heavy. The kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, but hollow. The kind of silence that made people whisper when they entered the room, as if even their voices might disturb something fragile. Henry was the only child of Victor Blake, one of the wealthiest businessmen in the state. The Blakewood Mansion, an enormous estate with marble floors, grand staircases, indoor fountains, and a sprawling garden, was filled with everything a child could ever want. Toy rooms, art rooms, a private library, a home theater, and even a personal zoo in the backyard. But despite all this, there was no laughter, no shouting, no footsteps running across the halls. There was only Henry. And Henry didn't walk. Since birth, Henry had been different, not in appearance. He was a perfectly healthy-looking boy with curly brown hair, intelligent green eyes, and a soft face that always looked like it was searching for something. But his legs, they never moved. Not the way they should have. Not the way everyone desperately hoped they would. He was born with no visible physical deformity. His muscles were fine. His bones were intact. His nerves responded. But his legs remained still. Dozens of doctors had come and gone over the years. The best pediatric neurologists from New York, Boston, and even Europe had flown in to examine him. Each one ran tests, scanned his brain, measured his reflexes, and consulted one another. In the end, nearly all of them reached the same conclusion. Henry's condition was not physiological. It was psychological. His body worked, but something in his mind refused to trust it. It was as if he had made a silent decision, deep within his subconscious, not to walk, not to stand, not to try. They called it psychosomatic paralysis, a complex, rare condition often triggered by early trauma or fear, though no one could ever pinpoint what had caused it in Henry's case. His birth had been normal. His mother, Eleanor, had passed away due to complications shortly after delivering him, but Victor had made sure Henry had every form of care, love, and attention money could buy. Still, nothing worked. Victor Blake, a man known across industries for being relentless and solution-focused, spared no expense. He flew in world-renowned therapists. He built a hydrotherapy center in the mansion's West Wing. He hired a private team of occupational specialists who rotated in shifts to work with Henry. Some used games. Some used virtual reality. Others used tough love. None of them succeeded. Victor himself, though always present financially, had become increasingly emotionally distant. It wasn't that he didn't love his son. He did deeply, but he didn't understand him. Victor was a man of results. And Henry, with all his quiet stillness, with all his refusal to move forward, was a constant reminder of something Victor couldn't fix. In meetings, Victor was a titan. In front of his own child, he was powerless. So he pulled away. He worked longer hours. He made himself busy. He told himself that providing more was the same as being present. Meanwhile, Henry continued to sit. Every morning, the staff would help him into his wheelchair and push him toward his favorite spot, by the large bay window in the east wing of the house. There, he would stare outside for hours, watching birds flit through the trees, watching gardeners trim hedges, watching clouds drift lazily across the sky. He rarely spoke. He rarely smiled. The housekeepers grew used to his silence, used to his blank stare. They stopped trying to talk to him. Some pitied him. Some just ignored him altogether. He wasn't unhappy exactly, but he wasn't living either. His world was a bubble of silence and stillness. No friends, no adventures, no movement. It was almost as if the house itself had absorbed his stillness, settling into a rhythm of muted existence. The air was always cool, the rooms always clean, the staff always composed, but there was no warmth, no energy, just routine. And so Henry remained a mystery, a small boy in a grand house, trapped not by a disease, but by something deeper, fear, grief, or maybe something no one could name. And in that stillness, he waited. For what? No one knew. Then one chilly Tuesday morning in early spring, something changed. A new maid arrived. Her name was Grace Thompson. She wasn't from any fancy agency, and she hadn't been handpicked by Victor's assistant. In fact, she was a last-minute replacement, hired through a local agency when the previous maid abruptly quit. Her resume didn't sparkle, but she was experienced, strong, and came highly recommended by word of mouth. She was older than the others, tall, graceful, with deep brown skin, expressive eyes, and a quiet confidence that made people take a second look without knowing why. She walked through the doors of Blakewood Mansion like she'd been there before. No one paid her much attention at first. Just another housemaid, another uniform, another face. But Grace was different. She didn't lower her eyes when she saw Victor. She didn't whisper in the halls. And the first time she saw Henry, sitting by the window, she didn't flinch or step back. She walked right up to him, knelt beside his chair, and smiled. "I had a boy like you once," she said gently. Wouldn't talk to anyone, wouldn't move. Until one day he did. Henry turned his head toward her. Their eyes met, and for the first time in a long while, something flickered in Henry's face. Not a smile, not a word, but something, a spark. And though no one noticed it that day, that tiny spark would grow. It would grow into something that no doctor, no machine, and no amount of money had ever been able to give him. A reason to try. Because Grace? She wasn't like anyone he'd ever met before. And she was about to do the unbelievable. Her name was Grace Thompson, the new live-in maid. She was 38, tall, proud, and black. Her back was straight like she'd carried the world and refused to bend. Her eyes, deep and watchful, hinted at stories she didn't need to tell. Grace didn't come from polished halls or elite schools. She came from a South Side, a place where survival taught wisdom faster than any book could. She had raised 3 children on her own, through poverty, sickness, and struggle, and all of them had made it out stronger. That was her greatest achievement. She didn't brag about it, but you could feel in the way she moved. Calm, unshaken, present. When she arrived at the Blakewood Mansion, the staff barely looked up. Another maid, another uniform, another one who would keep her head down, follow orders, and pretend not to see the sadness wrapped around the place like fog. That's how it had always been. No one stayed long. Most found the mansion cold, beautiful, yes, but haunted by grief and tension, especially when it came to the boy. Victor's assistant, Mr. Carruthers, met Grace at the entrance. He gave her the standard speech, the duties, the expectations, the unspoken rules. Then, with a clipped tone and barely a glance, he added, "The boy doesn't talk. Don't bother trying." Grace paused, one eyebrow slightly raised. She didn't respond, just nodded like she'd heard him, then quietly rolled her suitcase through the grand marble foyer. But inside, she was already rewriting the rules. Grace wasn't one to take orders from silence. On her very first morning, while the other staff rushed around, trying to impress Victor, she walked at her own pace. She took in everything, the echo of the halls, the polished silver, the absence of warmth. She noticed the flowers in the vases were fresh, but had no scent. The paintings on the wall were expensive, but soulless. Everything in that house was curated, perfect, dead. And then she saw Henry. He was in the garden, alone, as usual, sitting in his wheelchair beneath the old willow tree that bowed gently over the pond. His head was tilted slightly down, watching a leaf float on the water. He didn't hear her approach, or maybe he did and just didn't care. Grace didn't hesitate. She walked up to him, bent down so her eyes were level with his, and smiled with warmth. Not the fake, forced kind people used when they didn't know what else to do, but the real kind. The kind that said, "I see you, and I'm not afraid." "I had a son who didn't talk either," she said, her voice soft but certain, till he found his reason. Henry turned his head slowly, surprised. Not because of her words, but because she had spoken to him like a person, not a patient, not a problem, just a person. He blinked. His lips twitched, like maybe he had something to say. But nothing came out. Still, Grace smiled again, as if he'd said 1,000 things. Then she stood and walked away. That evening, she asked the kitchen staff where Henry liked to sit for dinner. They told her he never ate with anyone, only alone, by the windows in the East Wing. The next morning, she passed him again, this time on the patio. "Morning, Henry," she said, cheerful but not pushy. No response, but she kept walking. Every day after that, Grace greeted him the same way. Whether he was in the garden, in his chair near the bookshelves, or sitting silently beside a window, she acknowledged him. Not with forced cheer, but with genuine presence. She didn't ask questions he wouldn't answer. She didn't pity him. She didn't hover. She just saw him, and that was more than anyone else had done. Sometimes, she'd hum songs while folding laundry, and he'd listen without turning his head. Other times, she'd sweep the hallway near where he sat and tell stories to no one in particular. Stories about growing up in the South, about her kids, about the stubborn cat that used to sleep in her kitchen sink. She didn't care if Henry responded. She just let him hear life. Weeks passed. Other staff barely noticed anything different. To them, Henry was still the quiet boy who sat and stared. But Grace had noticed something shift. Once, he followed her with his eyes as she walked across the hall. Another time, he smiled, just for a second, when she nearly dropped a tray and caught it at the last moment. One night, when the wind howled and thunder shook the windows, Grace found him sitting in the corner of the library, a blanket pulled over his lap. She didn't say a word, just sat on the other couch, opened a book, and began to read aloud. Nothing dramatic, just the story. Soft, calm, steady. She didn't look at him once, but after 20 minutes, she heard it, the faintest whisper. What happens next? She didn't even flinch, just turned the page and kept reading, her smile hidden behind the book. After that night, Henry still didn't talk much, but something was happening, something no doctor had been able to touch. A connection, a tiny bridge being built between two very different lives. Grace never brought attention to it, never praised him or made him feel like a science experiment finally progressing. She just continued to be there, consistent, grounded, kind. Then, one day, something happened no one expected. It was a Sunday morning, early. Most of the staff were off or still asleep. Grace was in the main hall, mopping the marble floor with jazz music playing softly from the old radio she always carried with her. It was an upbeat tune, full of horns and rhythm. Grace, always unable to resist a good beat, danced a little as she worked. Nothing dramatic, just a sway of the hips, a spin of the mop, a little shimmy here and there. She didn't know Henry was watching. From behind the pillar, Henry sat in his chair, eyes wide. He had never seen anything like it. Not in this house. Not in his world. Someone being so free. He didn't know what to call the feeling growing inside his chest, but it was loud, alive. And then, without realizing it, he laughed. Not a loud one, just a soft, stunned chuckle, like the sound surprised even him. Grace froze mid-spin. She turned, saw him watching. Their eyes met. "Your turn, sugar," she said with a grin, extending the broom like a partner offering a hand. Henry stared at it, at her, at the floor between them. His lips parted. "I can't," he whispered. Grace walked over slowly. She knelt again, like the first day. "Can't," she said gently. "Or never tried." And then she stood and walked away. She didn't wait for him to respond. Didn't pressure. Didn't lecture. She just let the music play. Let the moment hang. And behind her, something stirred inside Henry. Something deeper than nerves or fear. A question. A possibility. And for the first time in his life, he wanted to try. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind where the skies sat low and heavy, and the clouds seemed unwilling to leave. Raindrops tapped steadily against the tall windows of the Blakewood mansion, streaking down the glass like slow-moving tears. The air inside was thick with the scent of polished wood and lemon cleaner. Most of the staff were busy, moving in a quiet, practiced rhythm, dusting picture frames that didn't need dusting, straightening pillows that hadn't been touched. Victor Blake was out for the day, tied up in yet another boardroom negotiation somewhere downtown. The house was quieter than usual. It always was when he was away. Henry sat in the grand hall, in the same place he always did, his wheelchair positioned by the large bay window, facing out toward the gardens now blurred by sheets of rain. He watched the water slide down the panes in twisting patterns, pretending they were rivers cutting through mountains or roads leading to places he'd never been. The world outside looked soft and gray, still, almost like his life. His fingers traced small circles on the armrest of his chair. The hall was so silent, he could hear the clock ticking on the far wall. Tick, 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 the same rhythm he'd heard for as long as he could remember. Another moment passing, another hour spent not moving, not speaking, not being part of anything. And then, music. Not the kind of music that usually played in Blakewood, not the classical string quartets or piano solos Victor insisted on. This was different. It was alive, loud, joyful, brassy, and bold. Jazz. It came drifting from the kitchen, weaving through the house like perfume. Horns blaring, drums bouncing, a woman's voice belting out a melody about love, loss, and finding your way again. Henry blinked. For a moment, he thought maybe the house was playing tricks on him. But no, it was real. Curious, he turned his chair slowly, pushing the joystick with small, deliberate movements. He followed the sound down the long hallway, the wheels of his chair humming gently over the floor. As he neared the kitchen, the music got louder, richer, fuller, like it had its own heartbeat. And then he saw her. Grace. She wasn't just mopping. She was dancing. There she was in the middle of the kitchen, one hand gripping a broom like a microphone stand, the other twirling a mop like a dance partner. She spun in wide circles, dipped low, popped back up with a laugh that echoed off the tiles. Her feet tapped and slid. Her hips swayed with the rhythm. She wasn't just cleaning. She was celebrating. Her body moved with a freedom that defied the rules of the mansion. She didn't care who saw, didn't care what was proper. For those few minutes, she wasn't a maid in a rich man's house. She was a queen in her own world. And the music, the music, it wrapped around her like sunlight, like joy itself had finally found a way into the house and decided to stay a while. Henry froze in the doorway. He didn't know what to make of it. No one moved like that here. No one laughed like that. No one acted like life was something to dance with. Not in Blakewood. Not in his world. His mouth parted just slightly. His eyes widened. Something inside him stirred. He had seen people move before. Nurses, therapists, other children on screens. But this was different. This was freedom. This was courage. This was a person saying, "Look at me. I'm alive, and I don't care who knows it." And something in him responded. His lips twitched at the corners, then curved, and before he even knew what was happening, a sound escaped his throat. Not a word, not a cough, but a laugh. Soft at first, just a tiny burst of air, but it was there, real, undeniable. Grace stopped mid-twirl. She turned toward the doorway, mop in hand, and there he was, Henry, watching, smiling, laughing. It was the first time anyone had heard that sound from him in years. She didn't say anything right away. She just stood still, surprised, a grin spreading slowly across her face. Not the smug kind of smile that said, "I told you so." No, it was a smile of recognition, like she had just found a hidden treasure in plain sight. Well, she said, catching her breath. "Didn't know I had an audience." Henry's cheeks turned red. He looked down for a second, but then glanced back up at her. "And Grace," she winked, "told you dancing could change things." She walked over, her steps still bouncing to the rhythm of the fading song. She knelt in front of him again, just like she had the first day. "You like music, don't you?" Henry nodded. "Just once. Slow." "Me too," she said. It speaks when words don't know what to say. She didn't ask why he laughed. She didn't ask what it meant. She didn't ruin the moment with questions. Instead, she stood and held the mop out like an invitation. "Your turn, sugar." Henry's eyes fell on the mop, then his feet, then back to her. He didn't move, but for the first time, he wanted to. His fingers gripped the armrest of his wheelchair a little tighter. Something inside him whispered, what if? What if he could? What if he tried? What if? But Grace didn't push. She didn't coax. She just turned back to the music, turned it up a little louder, and began to dance again. Not for him, not for anyone, but because that's what she did. She lived, and as she danced, Henry didn't look away. He didn't return to the window. He didn't fall back into silence. He watched. He listened. He felt. For the first time in a long time, he felt something other than fear. The jazz soared through the room, and Grace twirled with it, and Henry laughed again, this time louder. In that moment, the rain outside didn't matter. The silence in the mansion cracked open just a little, and inside that crack, something new was growing. A seed of courage, a whisper of hope, the beginning of something impossible. Grace noticed him watching from the doorway and didn't miss a beat. Her feet slowed, her spin softened, and she offered him a wink, a warm, unspoken "I see you," the kind that made someone feel like they mattered. "Your turn, sugar," she said with a playful grin. Her tone wasn't mocking or pressuring. It was casual, like offering a dance to a shy friend at a summer barbecue. With the music still buzzing in the background, she turned the volume down just slightly, enough to bring a kind of intimacy to the room. Then she gently slid the broom across the floor toward Henry, its wooden handle spinning until it stopped right in front of his wheelchair. Henry looked down at it, the broom, the floor, then his hands. He stared, frozen, not in fear exactly, but in disbelief. No one had ever asked this of him. No one had invited him in. He'd always been the observer, the quiet one in the corner, the boy people spoke about, but rarely, too. The broom now lay like a bridge between him and the rest of the world, between who he had always been and who he might be. His fingers flexed against the armrests of the chair. His eyes darted to Grace. "I can't," he said, barely above a whisper. His voice trembled like a paper boat on a river. Grace didn't flinch. She didn't tilt her head or soften her voice into that condescending baby tone so many others used. Instead, she leaned in, not too close, just enough that her voice felt personal, secret, safe. "Can't?" she asked gently. "Or never tried?" The word struck something in him, something raw and buried. No one had ever asked him that before. Every adult in his life, doctors, nurses, teachers, had always framed his silence and stillness as a limitation, as something wrong with him. But here was Grace, a woman he barely knew, looking at him as if he had choices, as if fear wasn't something to obey, but something to challenge. Henry's hands trembled. His legs felt heavy, like logs, like cement, like they were asleep and had been for years. But inside him, something had already awakened. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. Grace saw the shift in his eyes. Still, she didn't push. She smiled softly, stood upright, and nodded toward the music. "Dancing makes you forget what you're afraid of," she said as she turned to leave, "even if it's falling." And just like that, she walked away. She didn't hover to see what he'd do. She didn't beg or bargain or explain. She trusted him with the moment. That night, Henry couldn't sleep, not because of nightmares or discomfort, but because something in his chest felt different. It was like a bird flapping its wings for the first time, a quiet flutter of hope that wouldn't let him rest. He kept hearing her words in his head. "Can't?" or "I never tried." By morning, the mansion had returned to its usual rhythm. Quiet footsteps, polished surfaces, polite silence. But Henry? He was waiting. He positioned his wheelchair earlier than usual, this time not in the window nook, but right outside the main hall, where Grace usually cleaned in the mornings. And like clockwork, there she was. Same mop, same broom, same music, jazz, joyful, confident. And she danced. Not for him, not to impress, but because it was who she was. Grace swayed as if the mop were a dance partner, her feet moving in small shuffles and slides, her shoulders bouncing to the beat. She sang under her breath, spinning around a pillar with the grace of a stage performer. She made the mansion feel like a theater, or better yet, a home. And then, Henry moved. At first, just a shift. His hands pressed into the sides of the chair. He took a breath, the kind of breath people take before diving into deep water. Then, slowly, he leaned forward. His right foot twitched. His knee bent. His heart pounded like a drum. He didn't think about what might happen. He didn't think about falling. He thought about the broom, the music, her words. And then, with every ounce of will he had inside his small body, Henry stood, wobbly, crooked, shaking, but upright, on his own 2 feet. Time seemed to slow. Across the hall, A young maid carrying a tray dropped it with a loud crash. She screamed, not in fear but in shock. Dishes shattered across the marble floor. Another staff member rushed in from the next room, nearly tripping over herself. "Mr. Blake! Mr. Blake!" she cried, voice cracking. "It's Henry. He's standing." The entire mansion rippled with panic and disbelief. Victor Blake was already on the property. He had returned early from his trip. When he heard the screaming, he ran, something he hadn't done in years. Not since Eleanor died. He ran through the corridor, past the statue in the foyer, past the chandelier hanging from the ceiling, until he reached the hall. And there was Henry, standing. And not just standing, stepping. One foot forward, a wobble, then the other. His arms were out for balance, like wings. He was shaking like a leaf. And then, step and step, Victor fell to his knees. Tears streamed down his face. Not gentle tears, but years of grief pouring out in one heavy, breathless moment. He watched his son move, something he had only dreamed of, something he thought he'd never see. "My God," he whispered. "My son." Across the hall, Grace kept sweeping. She didn't run to Henry, didn't cry out in shock. She didn't even break her rhythm. She just gave a small nod, her lips lifting into a proud smile. As if she knew, as if she had known all along. She turned, dipped, and spun once more with the broom, and let the music carry on. Henry reached her just as the final note of the song faded into silence. His arms wrapped around her waist. Grace froze. Then slowly, she leaned down, arms embracing the boy she'd only met weeks before. The boy no one thought could stand, speak, or smile. "You did it, sugar," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion but steady as ever. He pulled back, looked up at her, and said something he'd never said before. "Thank you." Grace wiped a tear from his cheek and said, "Don't thank me. You've always had it in you. I just turned the music up loud enough for you to hear it." And in that silent, stunned, tear-filled mansion, where even the wind outside had stopped to listen, a boy who had once known only stillness began, finally, to live. Victor dropped to his knees. He didn't think. He didn't care who was watching. He just dropped, suddenly, heavily, like the weight of years had finally collapsed on top of him. His tailored suit crumpled against the polished floor. His polished image, the one he wore like armor in boardrooms and media appearances, shattered in an instant. He looked up at his son, standing, truly standing, just a few feet away, and it broke him. Tears welled in his eyes and spilled over, trailing silently down his face. The proud, calculating billionaire who had dominated mergers and out-negotiated prime ministers could no longer form a complete sentence. How did you do this?" he asked, his voice barely audible, as if he were afraid the truth might undo him further. He turned toward Grace, his eyes wide, disbelieving. His hands trembled slightly, the same hands that had signed billion-dollar deals with unflinching control. Now, they shook like a frightened child's. Grace paused, resting both hands on the broom. She was still for a moment, her expression unreadable, before she slowly nodded. She didn't grandstand. She didn't bask in the attention. She didn't act like she'd performed a miracle. "I didn't do anything fancy," she said with a calm shrug. "I just saw the boy, and I let him see joy." The room went still. The maids, the chefs, the butlers standing in the hallway, the gardener who had rushed inside, all of them stood motionless, watching the scene unfold like it was sacred, like something bigger than any of them had just happened. Victor stared at her. "All the money in the world," he whispered, almost to himself, "and it couldn't fix him." His voice cracked, the realization settling like a stone in his chest. Years, 8 long years, he had chased answers, chased cures, chased control. He had spent fortunes, called in favors, flown Henry across oceans, and nothing had worked. Nothing had reached his son. Until now. Until her. Grace looked at him directly. Her voice was gentle, but her gaze was steady, the kind of look that could both comfort and correct. "Money helps, sir," she said, "but it don't raise children. People do." The words cut clean and deep. Victor looked away, ashamed, because deep down, he knew she was right. He hadn't meant to fail Henry. He thought giving him everything meant being everything. But he had built a palace of silence, filled it with riches, and left his son alone in the middle of it. Henry had grown up surrounded by priceless things, and yet starved of the one thing he needed most: presence, love, connection. From that day forward, everything changed. Henry walked every single day, at first just a few steps, then down the hall, then through the garden. Eventually, he walked freely from one end of the estate to the other, his posture straighter, his gaze more alive. He laughed more too. That quiet chuckle that once startled everyone became a regular sound in the mansion, like sunshine breaking through clouds. And he talked, not all the time, not about everything, but about the things that mattered. What he dreamed of, what he feared, what made him smile. Every Friday, without fail, Henry danced with Grace in the kitchen. It became a tradition. The jazz music would start around noon, loud and unapologetic. Grace would be sweeping. Henry would arrive, no longer in a wheelchair, but walking, sometimes even dancing his way in. The two of them would laugh, spin, sweep, and sway like the whole world was watching, even when it wasn't. The staff began to gather around just to catch glimpses. Some recorded it. Others simply smiled and whispered to one another like they were witnessing something magical. Because they were. Victor started showing up too. At first, he stood at the doorway, watching silently. Then, one day, Grace caught him lingering and called him in. "You got legs too, boss," she teased. "Might as well use them." Victor laughed, a sound he hadn't made in years, and stepped in awkwardly, letting Grace guide him through a slow, clumsy shuffle. It wasn't long before Fridays became sacred. Not for business, not for meetings, but for dancing. Victor never missed one. At the end of that first week after Henry walked, Victor tried to write Grace a check. A big one, more than most people made in a lifetime. She looked at it, then at him, and shook her head. "I didn't do it for the money," she said. "I did it because that boy deserved someone who believed in him, someone who didn't talk about him like a case file." Victor lowered the check. "Then what can I do?" he asked quietly. She smiled. "Be his father. For real this time." And he did. Victor learned how to be present, how to stop checking his phone at dinner, how to listen without solving, how to laugh without guilt. He and Henry built model trains together, grew vegetables in the garden, and read books aloud at night like the years between them had never passed. And Grace? She stayed, not as a maid, but as part of the family. She had her own room now, sunlit, cozy, filled with photos of her kids and drawings from Henry. She didn't scrub floors anymore, but she still swept on Fridays because, as she said, sweeping clears more than just dust. It clears space for joy. And the Blakewood mansion, once cold and echoing, became warm, alive. It smelled of cinnamon and fresh bread. Music played not just in the kitchen, but in the living room, the garden, even the library. People laughed. Doors stayed open. And silence, once the ruler of the home, now lived quietly in the corners, respected but no longer feared. Sometimes, guests would ask Victor how it all changed. He would pause, glance at his son who now ran through the halls barefoot, and say, "It started with a broom, and a woman who wasn't afraid to use it." Because the miracle wasn't in medicine. It wasn't in technology or therapy. It was in a smile, a song, a moment of dancing when no one else was watching. A broom in the hand of someone who saw what others ignored. Because when Grace danced, she wasn't just cleaning a floor. She was clearing away fear, worry, loneliness, the kind that no surgery could touch. And Henry? He didn't need fixing. He needed hope. And one woman, one powerful, soulful, dancing woman, gave it to him, one step, one smile, one sweep at a time. If you found this story inspiring, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another powerful video. Thanks for watching.